Hello and welcome. In this video we're going to look at installing Server 2012 Release 2, how to configure it through VirtualBox. So our first step is we've got VirtualBox open here. As you can see, we've got no virtual machines. So our first video is going to look at creating an empty VirtualBox container where we will then install Server 2012. When we click on New up here, we'll be asked for the name we want to give to the virtual machine. In this case, I'm going to call this base server. The reason being that we're going to look at cloning virtual machines as well. There's the location where I'm going to store my virtual machines. It's going to be a Windows operating system as opposed to Linux or anything else. And in this case, we're going to select Server 2012 Release 2. And we can see that it's 64-bit. If you do not see 64-bit options, then you need to go to your BIOS and enable virtualization technology in the BIOS. That will be dependent on the virtual or on the device you have yourself. Next on that, we have memory, and in this case, I'm going to leave the memory at 2 gig. Generally, we would allocate a lot more memory for a server, but because it's only going to be a test virtual machine, 2 gig is sufficient. And again, this will all be dependent on the physical memory you have in your host operating system itself. Next on that, and we have an option to create virtual disks. These are going to emulate what an actual physical disk would be. We don't need to create one just a moment, but in this case we're going to create a virtual hard disk. Later in another video we'll look at adding more virtual disks. And we're going to create an empty virtual hard disk. It's going to be structured in the VirtualBox format. This one, VDI, is VirtualBox's format. This is Microsoft's Hyper-V format, and the VMDK is VMware's format. We can select any of them as VirtualBox supports all these formats, but as we're only going to be using VirtualBox, we'll stick with VDI. If you want to use a different type, you can go ahead and use it. The storage on physical hard drives has two options, dynamic or fixed size. The difference is dynamically allocated is very suitable for test environments, in that if we say we've got a 2 terabyte hard drive, we are not going to use 2 terabytes of space. It will only use the space that's required at that moment in time. So when we install the virtual machine here, or the structure for the virtual machine, we'll only be using a 4 or 5 meg. However, after we install Server 2012, we may be using something like 30 gig. If we go with fixed size, we will allocate that space there and then. So if we say 200 gig, we will use 200 gig on our hard drive. For our test environment, dynamically allocated is quite sufficient. Next on that, and it asks us where we're going to store the virtual machine's disk file, the VDI file, what we're going to call it, and in this case the disk is going to be called base server VDI, and what size the initial size is going to be. I'm going to change that to 200 gig, and remember we will not be using 200 gig of space because it's dynamically allocated. We'll have a look at the size after we create it. Click create, and we create an empty virtual machine. So we have our base server, and this is more or less like looking at the BIOS settings. It's a summary of all the configuration settings you have. Up here on top we have a settings option, and in the settings option we can see where we've got the name of the computer, and remember the name we're putting in here, base server, only relates to the name of the machine in VirtualBox. We will still have to name our own server. It will be Windows 2012 64-bit, and that's the ISO that we're going to be referencing shortly. Under the Advanced tab, and again this screen may slightly differ depending on the operating system you're using, such as a Mac and that, but the menu items are the same. We can see where we've got a snapshot folder. Later on we look at creating snapshots of virtual machines, which means we can revert back to a previous version when we need to. I'm going to put on shared clipboard, and I'm going to put on drag and drop. This means that we will be able to take icons on our desktop and drag them onto our virtual machine and vice versa. Description, we have nothing. Disk encryption, not really worried about. So base server, Windows server, 64-bit, and the only thing I've changed there is the drag and drop and the shared clipboard. For the system information, we will not be using a floppy drive, so we don't need a floppy drive. So again, this is very much like a BIOS startup. So the only thing I'm changing here is a floppy drive. I'm not changing the memory, but if you've allocated too much memory, you can always slide this down. To make any changes like this, you need to power off the virtual machine. Processor, I would recommend you leave it on a single processor, as in VirtualBox, by adding multiple processors, it can actually overutilize your physical host machine. So one processor is fine. Display, we need do nothing really in here. Storage, there's our hard drive. We will look at adding a virtual ISO disk in the next video. So basically we've got an empty virtual disk base server.bdi. Audio, I'm leaving all the defaults. Network, I'm leaving all the details as they are. We'll look at networking later on. And basically that's all I'm really going to look at. So all we've done really is checked our motherboard. We've taken off floppy. We have left it at one processor. And in general, we've left the naming convention the same, and we've added on bidirectional support. Now, when we click OK, we are left with an empty base server, which we still don't have an operating system to work with. So the last thing we're going to do in this video is we're going to add in the ISO, which basically is the equivalent of a DVD, as if we had a physical machine. So when we come to storage, you can see you've got your base server BDI file, and we've got an empty DVD drive. So all we're going to do is come over here to the right, click on the icon, and we're going to choose a virtual optical disk. I'm now going to go to my downloads, and there's my Server 2012 Release 2 Evaluation ISO, and open on that. And that means when we start the virtual machine up, it will actually start reading from this ISO, and that will allow us to install Server 2012. So that's our machine configured, ready to start install, and we will cover that in detail on the next video.